Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending and coming to our event. This is Caldwell Intellectual Property Law. My name is Iyab Yohannes. I'm the marketing director here at Caldwell. And so I'm really happy to see you all here in person. And also we're doing a hybrid event. So there's also a lot of people here on Zoom. So hello to our Zoom attendees. And welcome to our new space, actually, first and foremost. This is our expansion space. We literally just finished renovations. There's some furniture that's trickling in, but we have not fully installed here just yet. So you're getting an exclusive view of our new expansion office and the beautiful views over there. And I hope you guys partook in the refreshments and snacks that we had. So today we're going to talk about the role that universities and other academic institutions can play in fostering innovation, particularly through the use of tech transfer offices. And at Caldwell, we have deep experience helping startups and the entrepreneur community navigate the tech transfer and intellectual property landscape. And frequently we assess our clients in negotiating with TTOs, tech transfer offices, by evaluating licensing needs and terms. In addition, we have a global reach. We have offices in Santa Monica, California, London, and of course, Boston, and where we collaborate with tech transfer offices and around the globe. And to that effect, we're actually in the process of writing or we're creating a resource guide on how to foster cultures of innovation at tech transfer offices. So be sure to look out for that. My name is Iyab again, and you have my email address, I'm sure, so you can email me and we can definitely put you on our list once that's out. And so we're really excited to gather here today. And for this event, I've brought Katie Rubino, who's partner and chair of life sciences here at Caldwell. And we have Micah Drayton, who is a partner and chair of technology here at Caldwell. And so let's just get into it. So I have a few questions, and in terms of how we're breaking it up, like first off, we're going to be thinking of this from the perspective of a startup. And so a startup that's formed at a university or a academic institution. So first question would be, what is the purpose of a TTO? So who would like to answer that, Micah?
Yeah, a tech transfer office is intended to act as a gateway or bridge between the people who are performing the innovation in an academic institution, the students, professors, postdocs, and so forth, and the business community they're trying to enter, including how TTOs can work, among other things, to set up funding for people, to connect them to mentors, to help them build teams, and to get them started on finding intellectual property protection for all the ideas they've come up with.
And I'll just add there too, that TTOs, they can be found at universities, also at hospitals, really at centers where a lot of research and innovation is occurring.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katie and Micah. So I guess then when should a startup make a disclosure to a TTO?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that's a very case-by-case specific basis. So essentially, each TTO will have a set of rules around disclosure. And a lot of those rules come out on websites that's publicly available. And depending on maybe what your role is at the university or the research center, that will dictate what type of disclosures you need to provide to the university. You know, we've seen ones where it's very, I would say, loosely written, where maybe if you don't use a lot of university resources, you don't need to provide a disclosure. Whereas we've also seen ones that fall on the other end of the spectrum, where if you are even doing research on your own time, that warrants a disclosure. So really reading the language and understanding how it applies to your set of circumstances here will help guide you on when to make a disclosure.
Yeah, and I would also say the agreement that you'll have with your TTO is a legal agreement. And so, at least in theory, you've had an opportunity to review it if you're working in an academic institution. I've often found that people will agree to those things in a sort of a click-through way when they didn't think they were going to be coming up with anything in particular. And so, you might have to find out what you have agreed to, but it should be available to you. And I'm sure, generally speaking, your local TTO would be happy to share the agreement with you again if you aren't sure what it contains. Because it is very case specific, of course.
And sometimes too, we'll also see these agreements in your employee contract, you signed when you started working, let's say at a university as a faculty member. So sometimes you need to ask human resources for some advice as well.
And I guess what advice would you have for a student or postdoc or faculty member affiliated with the university who's interested in developing a startup business, whether it originates from research at an academic institution or from independent work? And does that matter as well?
Well, I think first of all, find out what the rules are for interacting with the TTO. And I'd say it's never too early to start cultivating a relationship with the TTO and to start networking, because ultimately networking is the superpower of businesses. This isn't really TTO specific at all, but the better you are at finding people and getting people together, developing assembling your heist team or whatever, that the more likely you are to succeed. Nobody does it alone. And an extension of that, you should have a relationship with the people that you might have to negotiate with within your university or other academic institution, as well as people like faculty members, other team members who are doing research with you, and so forth.
And does a university have any interest, like any direct financial interest in businesses and or IP that are quote unquote spun off from that university?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that also is kind of a case by case specific basis. So sometimes based on the licensing rights, the university might retain some ownership in the company. Other times, maybe the company is just going to pay milestone payments back to the university. Really, it depends. Some universities, and we'll touch on this later when we talk about licensing, but some universities would use just kind of one standard form licensing agreement. Others will negotiate each license individually. So really, it's a very case by case basis here. But I think the point to remember here is that a lot of really large companies today, publicly traded entities, have all started at TTOs. And Micah can really talk about this from the tech side as well here.
Well, yeah, like for example, Stanford University is where Google and Cisco got their starts, as well as I think Hewlett Packard. And of course, everybody around here knows MIT has a history of spinning businesses off as well, especially in the tech world.
And does this foster or inhibit innovation? What are your takes on that?
I think that the way universities dictate the terms under which people can sort of take their innovations and run with them can have various effects on the way people operate. So from the university's point of view, they're getting licensing revenue, and the revenue is helping to keep the doors open at the TTO in particular. But of course, if you overdo it with the licensing, if you ask for too much initially, then you risk squeezing people out of being able to start the businesses. Sometimes licensing terms can be stringent enough that it's actually difficult for people to get a start. And so there has to be a little bit of a balance. It's a little bit like we'll talk with tax policy, where there's a point of diminishing returns if you ask for too much, because people will sort of stop generating that revenue. And some universities tend to focus more on indirect ways of benefiting from the innovation of their members financially. For example, by opening incubation centers and essentially being the landlord for a bunch of businesses. That's an approach that people in the Boston area may have heard of people doing. And then, of course, you know, if they're being smart about it, they'll also try to work with the particular businesses they're dealing with to come up with something that's going to benefit both sides. Because obviously, if the business flourishes, then they get the goodwill, they get the prestige, they get students wanting to go there because they think they could be founding the next Hewlett Packard or Google or something. And so there's a balance to strike. I think it's more art than science, and every place is going to do it a little differently.
And I think too, just to add to what Mike is saying, we're seeing, if you go down the street to Kendall Square today, that area looks much different than it did, say even 10 years ago, right? And I think we're seeing this trend where universities are kind of creating these cultures of innovation where we're retaining all this talent and retaining all of this really forward-leaning tech to create these centers around the globe. We're seeing this, where all this research and innovation is happening, and all these startups are still staying in that geographical area and just creating more jobs and driving new ideas and bringing them to market that much quicker.
I love that idea, it's so true. I grew up in Cambridge, so I know like Kendall Square has completely transformed.
Yes.
And it is, it's interesting that point that you guys bring up in terms of fostering local innovation as well and retaining it. And so I guess also, how do TTOs vary in the degree to which they retain interest in IP and or businesses built around IP?
Well, I mean, building off what I just said, some of them are going to have a little piece of every business that spins out of them. If you actually in Massachusetts, universities are public charities, so you can actually go to the Attorney General's office over on Ashburton Street and look at the records to see what they have interests in. And I had to do that once for professional reasons, not for fun. And it was kind of interesting to see the different approaches. Some places will have lots of spin-off businesses that are clearly sounding in tech innovation and, probably patented technology. And others, they'll be mostly doing real estate. And then there's one university that's exceptionally large and wealthy that has all kinds of different business interests all over the globe.
And I know, Katie, that you had touched on this a little earlier. Yeah. And Katie, I know you had touched this earlier about like licenses. So I guess like what advice do you have for startup founders if they need to negotiate a license with a TTO?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very common question we see. So I think issue number one to consider here is startups need to think about what are not only the short-term implications of the license, but also the long-term ones, particularly if the TTO will be taking ownership in the company. Will that, make fundraising later on a little bit harder because there is some dilution there of ownership? So that's definitely issue number one that I'm thinking about. And then also thinking about the terms of the license. So some licenses will have, large upfront payments to acquire the IP. And for a startup, is that going to be economically feasible? Or will maybe getting some kind of license where payment is made over a period of time, is that going to be better? Or sometimes too, licenses where there's milestones based on where the innovation is at or where the company is at. When they reach X dollars of sales, they pay money, really thinking about what's going to put into place to help the startup really grow and become successful and not be weighed down by some parts of the license.
And so you talked about licensing terms. So I think you mentioned royalty payments, milestone payments. Are there any others?
Definitely, yeah. So there can be, again, it's a case by case basis, right? Some TTO offices, they just want to use one standard form licensing agreement for all their cases. Others want to negotiate each license individually because maybe the tech that's being innovated warrants that, and maybe there's different terms that might be more applicable to some types of tech than others. So it can be kind of any combination of any of those ideas. And really, it's just a very, I think, individual set of circumstances.
If an invention comprises some elements, this is a great question from Micah, our chair of technology, actually, in regards to open source, Micah. So if an invention comprises some elements that are open source, does a disclosure still need to be made to the TTO?
I'd say generally yes. It's important not to overstate the impact of open source licenses. If you're developing things on your own, then at least from the point of view of patent protection, what you're developing is on top of innovations that came before. And in many cases, the fact that you licensed the underlying technology one way or another isn't going to change the fundamentals of your patent protection process. A lot of the open source licenses primarily sound in copyright law, actually. And a lot of the technological protection, a lot of the technological IP protection you're likely to go for is going to sound more in patent law. And of course, hopefully your TTO is going to have spent some time thinking about this specifically and will have a policy or else a person at the TTO that you've gotten to know because it's an important player in your business strategy, potentially, who could tell you how they feel about the different open source licenses or even which ones they prefer and so forth. But I think it would be naive to assume that the fact that you've gotten something from a free software foundation or what have you means that you no longer have to deal with the TTO. Yeah.
And I would just add to that too, there's also this kind of, Mike and I are both mentors and provide pro bono advice, legal advice to startups. And we see this question a lot where a lot of startups think, oh, because I have open source materials in my idea, I can't get a patent on it. And I think it's worth mentioning too that just because, especially we're seeing this trend a lot more in the artificial intelligence, machine learning area, where maybe we're using some open source data banks to drive some of these models or train some machine learning models. And just because you're using open source tech doesn't make your idea unpatentable. There's still very ripe areas for patenting, and startups should still be very heavily thinking about patenting those ideas. Just because they use open source doesn't mean it's totally unpatentable.
Yeah, as a bit of an aside, I'd be careful about believing folklore, so to speak, about what is and is not patentable. What I mean is you'll hear news stories, and much like if you've got a specialty in a technical area and you've seen a news story that talks about a recent innovation or scientific discovery, you'll sometimes kind of roll your eyes at the way they talk about it. It's the same thing in the law. You'll get people with kind of oversimplified ideas about what you can and can't get patent protection on. And you certainly don't want to deny yourself an opportunity to develop a valuable asset for your nascent business venture because you thought it wasn't worth trying. A lot of people are willing to at least consult with you initially. I never personally charge people for consultations, and I don't think anyone else does, to just kind of run over what you've worked on and how you've worked on it in a confidential space. And you can get people who do this for a living to tell you what you might have that's patentable. You don't have to guess. I just mentioned that because I hear people a lot kind of giving themselves too much negativity on that subject.
Especially, I'd say too, around software.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks patents on software don't exist. They're not
Yeah.
patentable.
Or you can't get them in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of that is untrue, but
and talking about value, I guess, like number one question probably for a startup is, what is the value of a patent to a startup?
Well, I'd say that's a good question. We get that one a lot. And I'd say in the beginning, what that patent will do is really help the startup block other people from entering their space and stealing their idea, especially the startup wants to go raise money, maybe make disclosures, enter pitch competitions, and the patent's going to provide a lot of protection there. And as the startup kind of grows and expands, then that patent can serve as a tool really to create revenue streams for the company, whether that's through licensing deals, sales of the patent, or even just joint collaborations with other entities to monetize the patent.
Yeah, and the patent is property in the same sense. From a legal point of view, property is just a set of rights around something, and the patent is basically a right to exclude other people from something. You get patents, I tell clients this all the time, you get patents not necessarily on what you're doing, but on what you want to stop other people from being able to do. That doesn't mean you have to be all aggressive about it, but it means what you're creating is an actual asset. It has value. You can use it as collateral for debt-based financing. And you can use it as an asset, as part of the basis of value in equity-based financing. And we've actually seen some of our own clients have an astonishing amount of success in raising money solely off the value of their patent portfolio. So just as a fundraising tool, it can be quite useful in that respect.
And as a fundraising tool, how is patent valuation different for a license to university-owned IP versus independent startup-owned IP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's typically a very large difference. So if a startup only has IP licensed from a university, the valuation on that IP is going to not be as high as if the startup owns some IP, some patents outright. Because especially if we're talking about a license where maybe there's more than one party licensing the technology, that might further dilute the value of the patent if multiple parties are practicing the invention, right? Whereas if the startup owns their own IP, I think the latest numbers we have to date right now are based on the Richardson Oliver patent valuation report, which is like the preeminent source of patent values in the United States. Right now, one single US patent on a software invention is valued around $300,000. So I think talking to startups and having startups think about, yes, we need to maybe license some tech from the university, but also work on developing our own portfolio. That's going to be the greatest way they can add sort of the most value to their business.
Yeah, a case in point, and I think a good example of sort of the way all these things can fit together. We've got a client who started off at MIT and got fairly far into the postdoc world there, came up with an idea, kind of wants to be, you could say, like the next generation's Cisco in the internet, kind of the infrastructure people don't know about but underlies everything. And he might do it too. I'm rooting for him. Anyway, he licensed some of the key underlying technology for some of the ideas from some professors at MIT that he worked with. He developed an extensive portfolio of his own, going after various aspects of computer security and network communication, sort of the nexus of those things. And he ended up collaborating with people from another university who were working in a cryptographic space to help him further those goals. So ultimately, his company brought together the fruits of at least a couple, if not several, different academic institutions in various ways. And the license played an important role because it was right for him and because it was available on terms that worked for him. And then he built his own portfolio, which is now getting to be quite extensive based on his own innovation. And it's worth remembering, you're going to be generating new ideas. if you're going to have a successful business, you probably won't be a one-hit wonder. So I guess the only thing I would say is make sure that when you arrange your licensing, you allow space for that additional growth, and bear in mind that that license may not be a major part of what your corporation or other venture is going to end up being once you've really built it out.
I would just add there too, like in our experience as well, very rarely is the first patent that any company gets, whether it's their own patent or one licensed through a university, very rarely does that patent look anything like the product they go to launch with, right? There's always subsequent engineering, new ideas being generated. And it's kind of a normal course that some of that early IP kind of develops into subsequently new ideas and new IP that's generated later on.
So companies should think about like a strategy, an overall IP strategy of taking what you're saying, as opposed to just focusing on the one license that
That's
came from
right.
a CTO.
Yeah, comprehensive and evolving strategy is what I'd say.
Awesome. And only a small fraction, about 2% of US patents granted are assigned to academic institutions in a given year. So does this account for the number of innovations that are patented through TTOs? Are there patents generated by TTOs that are not assigned to the academic institutions of those TTOs?
I would say it doesn't account for everything that's going on. You've got to bear in mind that not every TTO is necessarily going to have a policy of licensing everything. TTOs regularly, they can and regularly do forego licenses they simply decide aren't worth getting a piece of themselves. Some TTOs prefer to do a sort of in-house or prosecution of patents or prosecutions with sort of trusted partners or partners that their state tells them they have to work with. Others are more likely to kind of tell somebody, you know, I'm not going to help you fund this very much, but take the ball and run with it. Some of them will have like a fund, and they'll help someone kind of get the first push, their first foray into fundraising, and then sort of let them go off and play on their own. So, I mean, a lot of those things are not going to be visible as licensing agreements with the TTO, but you could say that they still sort of came through the TTO or from the institution it represents. So the TTO's licensing could be an important source of revenue for it, but it might not represent everything they do. And then, of course, there are other cases where people actually license things directly from professors or from other people who've invented things. So yeah, the licensing revenue by itself doesn't necessarily reflect the full volume of what's going on there.
And how frequently are patents generated by students or faculty at universities or institutions that are not like routed through TTOs?
I'd say that can happen very frequently, especially if, let's say, the startup goes to the TTO and discloses the invention, and the TTO, remember, they're, you know, on a very limited budget, so they can't patent everything that's disclosed to them. They have to select what they think are the most economically viable inventions to bring to market and hopefully license. So a lot of times, even if you disclose an invention, they will waive rights to it and sign it back over to the startup if they feel this is not an avenue they wish to pursue. And then a lot of times those patents are then pursued by the startup, you know, with their own legal counsel that's going to fall outside the purview of the TTO.
Thank you. And so I guess now I want to ask questions from the perspective of like tech transfer offices. And so, or firstly, like what metrics are used to measure the success of a TTO?
Yeah, so this is like an area of a lot of conversation right now, because historically the metric used to determine TTO success is like any business, revenue generated. And I think that doesn't always tell the full story of what's happening at the tech transfer office, because of the revenue that's generated, let's say a TTO on a licensing deal takes 2 to maybe 10% of royalties from a startup, only about 25% of that 2 to 10% is going back to the TTO because, this revenue has to go in to fund other programs. It has to go back to the university. So that's not the most accurate predictor of TTO success. And I think, there's a lot of really great resources out there. Autumn is one of those, the Association of Tech Transfer and Monetization. And what they're talking about a lot is all of these other metrics that we can look at to evaluate and consider success of TTOs, things like how many startups are created at the university, how many licensing deals are generated. We're just seeing really a whole host of other metrics to really get a more holistic perspective of what's going on.
It's also worth remembering that the sort of prestige factor can't be discounted. Universities participate in a sort of a hype market, just like anything else. I mean, maybe that's a crass term to use, but part of the reason, one of the many reasons that a lot of people want to get into MIT, and it's so hard to get into, is because of the various things that MIT has produced. Yes, the academic work, the internationally known professors, the research and so forth, but also, its legacy of producing businesses, of producing companies, spin-off companies that go on to be successful in their own right. And you could say similar things about various other places like Viterbi in California, or Caltech, Stanford, all those places. For some reason, all the examples I can think of are in California. There are other places too, though.
There are other
Yeah,
places.
there are other places. Yeah. So, I mean, that has value. It makes the university itself desirable as a place to go as a student and as a place to go to work. It allows them to attract top talent at every different level. So, I mean, I won't say you can't put a number on that because I'm sure people do, but I'm sure that there are people who spend a lot of time putting numbers on that. And the point is, it's valuable.
Thank you. And what can TTOs and transfer offices do to incentivize innovation, and incentivize like development and even monetization of IP?
Yeah, I think that's a question even a lot of startups face too, of how can we continue to, capture new ideas and make sure we're keeping track of everything we're working on. But I think what a lot of TTOs do is really create environments to educate students and faculty about tech transfer, about disclosures, because a lot of people are just even unaware of the need to even do that or what the TTO even is. Sometimes too, we're seeing professors' ability to get tenure is tied to disclosures, how many disclosures they give, or how many products they disclose that get patented. So there's all sorts of different metrics and educational resources to kind of incentivize innovation and really try to capture as much innovation as possible.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I'd say there's seed funding, or rather really pre-seed funding. So that maybe not a vast amount, but if you need a few $1,000s here or there to just start to get your foot in the door, maybe do a quick one-off provisional to kind of put your stake in the ground. We've sometimes done that. Sometimes the TTO or a program is affiliated with the TTO can hook you up with that. And they often provide you with those first steps into the all important world of networking by associating you with mentors of all sorts and helping you to just meet with the various kinds of people that you might have to work with. Crossovers between engineering departments and business schools. You don't have to love each other, but you're going to need each other's skills. You're going to need someone who knows accounting. It's important. Yeah. So that kind of thing.
It's all about collaboration.
Exactly.
So what are the most successful TTOs doing to create cultures of innovation from your experiences?
Yeah. I'd say what they're doing is really helping bring ideas to market and really creating a lot of resources to help the startup along the way, because any startup, whether they're started at a university or outside a university, they're juggling a million things at once. But knowing where to go get help or seek resources and having those resources readily available, I think really helps foster that environment that we're speaking about.
I would suspect that there are a lot of different approaches people take, and I think that people have been successful in operating TTOs with a lot of different sort of ways of doing things in terms of the nuts and bolts. I think maybe a thing that the successful ones have in common is the ability to examine things, to examine the situation and to adapt. You know, you have to have policies that make sense, that can work efficiently, but I think you also have to be able to be flexible and do what it takes to really accomplish the goals that you're setting for yourself. That's important.
And in terms of efficiency, I mean, how effective are like those projects such as like innovation labs, incubators, mentorship programs, etc. How are they effective? How effective are they at producing IP and generating revenue for the associated universities?
I'd say I think they're very successful. They provide a lot of really kind of key resources for the startup and a lot of educational material and access to mentorship that maybe the startup wouldn't necessarily have. And I think too, there's also this great camaraderie at these sorts of incubators and startup hubs, because you can go talk to other startups who face similar challenges and understand, how did they kind of triage that issue. And you kind of feel like you're not alone, because sometimes, starting any company, it can be like very overwhelming and you don't know where to even go for help. And I think these places really help kind of teach a lot about entrepreneurship and just figuring out how to navigate that.
And I guess like also how do tech transfer offices identify potential licensees? Like what's the process? Is the process uniform? Probably not. Does it vary? How does it vary?
That's a good question. So I'd say probably the number one way to identify a licensee is if it's a startup, that's where you're going to go first, right? Because that's going to be who will be most interested in the tech. And if that's not the case, then there's other ways in which to identify licensees, thinking who are other maybe companies or startups operating in this space who would maybe be interested in a license. Autumn also has resources where you can list technology that you're looking to license. A lot of universities too have web pages where they list all the patents that they're looking to license. And you can go through by technology area and figure out, okay, which tech is available. So there's definitely a lot of different ways to approach this.
Yeah, and there's also, bear in mind, all those programs that the TTO has to help people start businesses. If the TTO is giving them a path that makes it easier for them to develop their business, they're also creating an incentive to work with the TTO and therefore to get on their radar. So you have on the one hand this agreement, it's probably sort of obligation to disclose things to the TTO. But then I think a very maybe somewhat overlooked thing is if the TTO has made it valuable for you to disclose things to the TTO, if they've made it into something that's going to help you, then it's an incentive. And then people are going to come to you because that benefits them. So that's another angle.
And I guess also, what areas of technology are TTOs interested in commercializing? Are there certain trends that you two have seen?
Yeah, I'd say from the university side of things, there's a lot going on with artificial intelligence, especially if you take it from the behaviorist point of view of simulating intelligent behavior in particular domains. So, things like machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, that sort of thing. There's a lot of innovation in that. And that's a hot area of technology. Of course, biotechnology has been for decades now growing absolutely explosively. There are there's a lot of research in pharmaceuticals, in treatments for specific conditions, in the bioinformatics and intelligence systems that underlie those things, including an increasing interface between biotechnology and computer technology, increasing, excuse me, automation. So that those are very hot areas. I'm sure everyone's aware universities and academic institutions were quite closely involved with the development of CRISPR, for example. It's come up in the news a bit. So things like that always. And yeah. Do you have any other examples?
Yeah, I'd say too, it just depends really where to the tech transfer office is located geographically, because, West Coast, we traditionally think about all these tech computer applications, programming. Here in Boston, we're at the hub of biotech innovation. So I think it also plays into what sort of research the university is sponsoring and where you're located about what tech is going to be most interesting to the tech transfer office.
Yeah, that's true. They'll play to the strengths of their institution.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I guess the last question to wrap it up and then open up into questions. Is there ever a good opportunity for a TTO to renegotiate the terms of a license to a spin-off company? Does that ever happen?
Yeah, I'd say the best, if I can just jump in, I think the best time to do that is when it's going to generate more value for you and or for the business. So, I mean, from the point of view of the TTO, a license is only going to be good if it's actually going to produce revenue. So if the business needs some kind of renegotiation that's going to produce, more for you in the long run, or else, will produce more goodwill or prestige and so forth. There's a lot of things to balance. So it's more art than science. But I think it's important to remember that the point of this whole enterprise isn't to enforce rules so much as it is to get what you want out of it. And what you want is a benefit to your institution and to your office. So that might be a little bit vague, but it really depends on the situation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's very kind of case by case, situationally driven.
Well, thank you both for something that I'm learning. It's been really fascinating, actually. And I guess we can open up into questions on in person if anyone has questions, or on Zoom. I know there's one question or so, maybe two that are on Zoom. So, any questions?
First of all, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned a lot from both the startup side and also from the TTO. So I feel like having those two perspectives is really helpful. And my question is, I didn't know the value of patent and to actually get a number. And you mentioned there's like a web page that you can check more or less what are the values. So if you're a startup and want to value how much your patent is, like to put a number on it, because I feel like that's also useful even if you're raising money.
Yes.
How do you do that process, especially because I think you also mentioned it's good if you own the patent and not the university, but also no one really wants to like have a story about MIT suing them because they're using their technology. So that I feel like that adds value to that.
Yeah, I think maybe I should clarify something we were saying. The license, the invention that you're licensing from MIT wouldn't necessarily be the same as the invention you're patenting, because I mean, obviously, if MIT is going to keep hold of MIT, for example, is going to keep hold of the patent and license it, then that's what you're going to do with that patent, probably, unless you can get them to renegotiate. The patent that you're going to get will be on your innovation, maybe something you build on top of the licensed technology, maybe something that kind of covers a different facet of your business approach, or just a different aspect of what you're doing. The point is that just remember to look beyond that licensing deal at the value you're going to create through your own innovation, which does not belong to, for example, MIT. Because if you leave them, then you're not going to be under an obligation to disclose anything to them anymore. You can always, stay in touch. So.
Yeah. And I just say too about the patent valuation. So it's very rare for a startup to just go get one patent value, right? Because the expense in having somebody, a patent broker, go do that is just way too much to incur. So what we use is kind of just a metric to kind of gauge where the portfolio is at, are some numbers generated by this Richardson Oliver group. They're out of California, and they're kind of the preeminent source of patent valuation. This information has only been publicly available about 5 or 6 years. And these are based on data driven through the brokered patent market. So these are patents sold through patent brokers, which is typically going to be used in situations where a company needs to get some cash quick because maybe bankruptcy is looming, or we need to sell off an asset to raise some capital to kind of fund a project, right? These are not sale prices we're getting from, sales in a merger and acquisition of a patent where we expect the price or the value to be much higher. So these are kind of just a very preliminary benchmark, but
a baseline.
Exactly. What these numbers tell us, this is coming from their 2020 report. The 2021 numbers are not going to be out till later this quarter, but what they tell us is that the average asking price of a software patent sold on the brokered patent market is around $300,000. If it's a family of patents where there's more than one patent filed, it's around $450,000. So this also tells us there's really good incentives to continue to file patents on new ideas that they're generating, because just from a monetary standpoint, this is going to grant more value to the company.
And then the particular institution or potential purchaser you're dealing with is ultimately going to have a say in how much the patent is worth to them.
Right, because these are, again, asking prices. So the sale price, it's like a piece of real estate. The sale price is going to be a little different from asking price, but these are just kind of good benchmarks to kind of show investors about the value of your IP.
So I guess I'm curious to be able to know what the inflections are for a disclosure to a TTO. As far as, okay, is it as soon as you've written a piece of code or developed a molecule, you have to disclose that immediately, or is it once you file for incorporation, or I guess not?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I'd say typically it's going to depend on the rules of the university. A lot of times, a lot of universities around here, what dictates disclosure is if you use a substantial amount of university-backed resources. What does that mean exactly? I'm not sure. There are some examples on different university websites. So if you spend, a certain amount of time in the lab, that warrants a disclosure. Sometimes too, disclosures happen even if the person who invents it or discovers it has no intention of commercializing it. You still want to just go disclose it, because that also just helps enhance that culture of innovation at the university. Because even if you don't want to, the person doesn't want to commercialize it, the university might. And we've seen, like, in the biotech space, Lyrica, the drug Lyrica that's used for fibromyalgia, that was started at a university, and that drove, billions of dollars of licensing revenue. So there's always good reason to go disclose the invention, even if you're not interested in it. And I just say too, the other question we get a lot of startups is like, they think, oh, if I go disclose this and I've known about this for a few months, I'm going to get in trouble. You know, the tech transfer office is not going to punish you. They're there to help you. They want to work with you. So they want to hear those disclosures.
Yeah, I'd say, again, yeah, what you actually should be doing will depend on the particular agreement you have with the TTO and what their policies are. There's this concept of reduction to practice, which is sort of the moment when you can go from, you know, I don't know, a lot of people probably had a friend who said they had invented something, and it's like, it would be great if, you know, if we could have a space elevator, or if we could have a, you know, a hover bike or something. And it's like, that's not really an invention, right? Because they can't actually make it. But, you know, so there's this kind of threshold you cross when you know how you're going to actually do the idea. And from a certain point of view, that's when you really have the idea. And that's kind of, I don't think any TTO is going to want to know your sort of speculative ramblings so much, but like once you've actually got an idea how you would really do something, or got a working prototype, stuff like that, that's probably the moment when you start thinking, you know, what's the rule here? What should I be doing? And keeping, you know, a nice, thorough dated lab notebook or something equivalent, you know, that could be a good idea, just so you kind of know what you've done. Show it to people.
And I do want to get at least one more question on Zoom. So someone writes, like, what other resources are available for TTOs or startups seeking more information on this topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say, well, Autumn certainly is a great resource. And Autumn has a lot of really nice just handouts about the tech transfer industry and what's happening. A lot of good statistics there. I'd say also, you know, we're working on publishing a book on this topic, and hopefully we'll have more details on that soon, but we really want to kind of provide a comprehensive resource guide for TTOs to kind of provide some advice on how to foster those cultures of innovations. And we've been, since really COVID began, we've been holding a lot of interviews with directors at TTOs across the world to gain really a global perspective on this idea. And there's probably a lot of experts on the live stream tonight from some of these institutions who could really speak to this topic. And we really want to just put some ideas out there for everybody.
Well, it is 6:30, just a little past, so we'll end right there. And I know that there's a few more questions on Zoom, so we'll type those questions and send them over. And if any of you have questions in person, feel free. We can continue having a drink, watching the sunset. Thank you so much for everyone attending in person and in Zoom. And especially thank you, Micah and Katie, for your time and expertise. Thank you.
Yeah.